Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring time, space, and trauma. With me is Dr. Anngwyn St. Just, who is a social traumatologist. She works all over the world, in particular going into war zones and helping people to deal with traumatic injuries and other forms of trauma. She is the author of a 2-volume series called Trauma, Time, Space, and Fractals, and is also the author of a 5-volume series of books on trauma and the human condition. Welcome, Anngwyn.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I know you do very difficult work, but you've come up with a unique approach to it. I might even say something of a theoretical breakthrough in applying the concept of fractals to the study of trauma. So let's, for the benefit of our viewers who may not understand what a fractal is, let's give them a definition.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a branch of mathematics known as fractal geometry that was discovered accidentally by Benoit Mandelbrot, who was a mathematician. And one day he decided to feed an equation into his computer. And he did that, and he went to get a cup of coffee, and he came back, and there were these patterns on his screen. He said, well, there's something wrong with my computer. So he put in another equation, he got another pattern. And then he realized these equations have visual patterns, and these patterns replicate through time and space, and they're self-similar in scale. So no matter what the scale is, whether it's micro or macro, it's the same pattern. Mm-hmm. And that began the branch of fractal geometry, and those equations are now known as the Mandelbrot set. And there's another set, which is the Julia set, and on, but that's all about mathematics, which is not my strong suit.
Mm-hmm. But you somehow came to appreciate that there's a relationship between these self-replicating patterns mm-hmm. and the study of trauma.
Absolutely. And that was also an accident. I did not set out to find the relationship between fractal geometry and replicating traumas. Not at all. Given that I'm dyslexic with numbers, anything having to do with mathematics in my education was painful, mm-hmm. often traumatic even. And when I was growing up, they didn't understand dyslexia, either with letters or with numbers. But my coping strategy was to avoid, in any way possible, anything that had to do with mathematics. And then the cosmic joke is that when I was confronted with a mystery, the answer was where I would never, ever look, which was in the field of mathematics. So that was a surprise.
So you had to confront your own trauma about mathematics in order to develop a theory of trauma.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even though I scramble numbers, I really recognize pattern very easily. I see patterns often where people don't. And the minute I saw the fractal visually, I made the connection to this pattern and self-replicating traumas. Mm-hmm. It was a process, went over many years. It sort of revealed itself to me step by step. I didn't have a plan that I was going from here to there. I was invited to be the trauma specialist in a family practice medical clinic in Boulder, Colorado. And they had many patients who had multiple accidents, particularly traffic accidents, with chronic pain afterward. They were not responding to conventional treatment, some closed head injury people as well.
I mean, after so many traffic accidents, they were so traumatized that they were unresponsive to the forms of treatment that were available to them.
They just, the pain continued, the accident patterns continued, whether they were passengers or drivers. So I thought, this doesn't make sense. So I thought, I can figure this out. This is, obviously, it has something to do with substance abuse. These people are somehow impaired neurologically. There's alcohol or drugs or something. And so I spent one evening at the clinic. I went through all of the charts in order to say, well, look, we really need a substance abuse program here. Not one.
How surprising.
Yeah. And so there I was with a mystery. How can this be happening? That people would have 15, 20 accidents.
And as I recall, there were maybe 15 or 20 people you're talking about.
Yes, more, actually, over time. Yeah, more than that. So, being a bubble bath theorist, what I did was retired to the bubble bath to take a nice long soak and think about this. And the answer was, of course, there, but I didn't see it. And in bubble baths, when you get really big bubbles, as they expand, right before the bubble gets thinner and thinner, and then you see these beautiful rainbow fractal patterns. It was right in front of my face, and I didn't see it because I hadn't seen fractals. So I was looking right at it, but I didn't recognize, well, the answer's right here in this bubble. In retrospect, I realized, it was right there, but I didn't see it because I didn't know about fractals. And in those days, very few people knew about fractals. So I thought, okay, what do I know? And what I did know at that point, this was the very early 90s, that trauma is not one event that happens to one person. That there's no such thing as, one trauma. That some of us get traumatized before we're born, as we're born, after birth, and so on. And trauma impacts the way we relate to all others, including our way to have relationship and also to parent.
There's a whole theory of personality developed by Otto Rank, a psychoanalyst, basically saying that human personality is fundamentally conditioned by the trauma of being born.
Well, that's the human condition.
Yeah.
And trauma, I would say trauma's in the contract on this planet. With some, it's very severe. With some, there is a major event that takes precedence, but they're little traumas, and there's cumulative traumas. Chinese water drip, and it's okay, this, and then cope, and then that, and then cope, and then there comes a breaking point, and then full-blown traumatic reaction.
In fact, as I recall, speaking of the Freudian approaches, there has been a speculation that the practice of circumcision is a form of deliberately instilling trauma on a young infant in order to, in effect, condition them to be obedient to the rules of the particular society or religion into which they're being brought up.
And in certain cultures, they circumcise little girls as well.
No.
It's both
So it's
ways.
deliberately induced trauma.
Yes, culturally, and that's a whole other topic.
Yeah.
So I had an image. I think particularly that trauma affects the way we relate to others, but also to parent.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, traumatized people tend to pass on the trauma to their children and so on.
Yeah. I mean, the Bible says the evil that men do shall pass on for 7 generations.
At least.
Uh-huh.
And the Native Americans say the same. 7 generations. So I had an image at that point. My image was a Chinese firecracker. So, with these firecrackers, you have a flashpoint of gunpowder at different points along this long rope. And what happens is any place you set that afire, the whole thing goes off. And that traumas tend to activate other traumas with other traumas. And it can be cumulative as well. And insurance companies don't understand this because they say, well, this was a simple fender bender, or the cat died, or somebody slipped on the ice and they had this full-blown traumatic reaction. But the fact is, it was cumulative, and then at some point, the organism was no longer able to cope with something that was cumulatively
The last straw.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really. And the insurance system is a very different system than...
Well, they know enough to raise your rates once you've had a little accident.
Absolutely.
They figure you're more prone to have another.
And they're right.
Mm-hmm.
They're absolutely right about that. So I had this firecracker, but this wasn't helping with why these people were having multiple accidents. So I thought, well, what else do I know? Well, I know that traumas tend to happen on the anniversary of previous unresolved traumas. Not previous traumas, but previous unresolved traumas.
Mm-hmm. Well, pretty much I would think all traumas are unresolved.
No, none at all.
How do you resolve a trauma?
Oh, we could talk about that for...
We'll have another conversation.
That's another conversation.
But,
and, trauma is not a life sentence. If I didn't believe we could resolve trauma, I would have bailed out of this profession long ago.
Well, what I mean, people can get on with their lives. Of course they can. But I tend to think that once you've suffered from a loss, you're never going to be completely the same as you were.
But that's not what healing's about.
Yeah.
Healing's not about being the same.
Mm-hmm.
That often trauma can be a transformative experience as well. And my experience is that trauma can heal, but you may not be, in fact, the same.
Yeah. I've certainly talked to people who have suffered from severe trauma and would tell me, gee, given everything that I have learned as a result of this trauma, if I had to do it all over again, I would.
Yeah, that's right.
I've heard people say that.
Yes, because that's, for some people, the only way they can change or break out of a pattern and so on.
Yeah.
But still, I had this mystery. So I thought, okay, start with the dates. So I sat with my patients, who were mostly women, but not all. And I said, let's look at the dates. And so we looked at the dates. And I said, do these dates mean anything to you? And what we found was that these dates with the women coincided with incomplete pregnancies. And there were 3 dates when the accidents would happen. The anniversary of the date of conception, of termination for whatever reason, and the date the baby would have been due. Now, this made no sense to me initially in a linear way of looking at it. But I was beginning to see this was in fact true, and I asked my patients to please go to their gynecologist, their obstetrician, to verify these dates, which the doctors were very annoyed. This lady from Berkeley's coming, wanting to, they just thought it was really silly. But my patients were very persistent because they felt there was something there that might help them. And then a lady came who had this pattern, and I said, well, I know there's this pattern. These are the dates, and I don't know why. And she said, oh, makes sense. An incomplete pregnancy is a violent disconnection, and an accident is a collusion,
a violent
connection.
Reconnection.
Yeah. And I thought, well, yes, in some kind of cosmic balance sense, but at that point, I could not imagine how this balance of this with that actually happens. So I sat with that for a few years, and I noticed that some of my patients who had these repetitive patterns were men. Mm-hmm. Of course, they'd never been pregnant, but they did have broken connections. And there was one gentleman who had, quote, an accident where he cut off his thumb with an axe when he was working. On the anniversary of the date when his young child was taken away from custody. And of course, it was unconscious. He hadn't made the connection of feeling like he lost a part of himself when that child was taken. This was violent, and he had the repetitive.
In other words, when a trauma like that occurs, it creates, you might call it a meme, some sort of a psychic pattern that is going to try and replicate itself.
Yes. But the pattern didn't lend itself to linear resolution. And so during the time I was in this clinic, we had the Sioux City air crash where the United flight went into the cornfield. And Denver is a United hub. And we worked with many of the survivors. And what we found is that the survivors of this air crash had a family history of airplane crashes, either as pilots or as passengers.
Interesting. Even as passengers, so that
yes.
It's not as if it's like something that the person has any kind of immediate direct control over.
That's right.
It's more of a synchronistic connection, or as Jung would say, a causal connection.
Yeah. And I remembered from marriage and family therapy theory, the genograms of family systems, and the Kennedy family has these airplane crashes beginning in the 1940s. JFK's older brother was killed during World War II as a pilot. His sister died in an airplane crash. Ted Kennedy's plane was struck by lightning. He survived. And, of course, JFK Jr. Perished. So there were generations of airplane crashes. So then I realized that with these accidents with my patients with automobiles, they were also passengers.
Same principle. Yeah.
So this, I was really almost obsessed with. I couldn't settle with coincidence, because in the genograms it was often, they didn't tell us how these patterns got started, why they got started, or how would you resolve one of these fractals if you didn't want it to keep replicating.
Now, for the benefit of our viewers who don't know what a genogram is, can you define that?
Yeah, just basically it's a family tree. It's a map of the family systems down through the generations. and you can see patterns.
Yeah.
You have cardiovascular families, you have accident families, you have, the Kennedys, they have a lot of trauma, transgenerationally.
Yeah.
So I had this unwillingness to accept this was simply coincidence, because I felt there was something else happening in this dynamic. And my firecracker wasn't helping.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in Jungian analysis at that time, very involved with learning about the numinous and dreams. I had an experience one afternoon where I was extremely exhausted for no reason. And I just had to lay down. And I lay down in my bed, and I was completely unable to move. I wasn't frightened. I just couldn't move. I was in some other holding pattern, I guess you would call it. And then, you know how whales have blowholes here? And this blowhole opened at the top of my head, right here. Oh, it seemed very natural at the time.
It sounds like hypnagogic imagery.
Yeah, something like that. And I could see it, but I could also feel it. So there was this blowhole. And then there were two what looked like black beetles. And they were going around the rim of this blowhole. And one says to the other, I think she's ready now. And they jumped into the hole, and it closed. And then I fell asleep. So I told my analyst about this, and he said, I don't know what it means, but I know it's important. But then I forgot about it. And then someone came to visit, and they brought me a book on time. And I looked at the cover, and I'm very visual, because like the number part doesn't work so well. Looked at this, and I thought, what is this? This is what I'm seeing clinically. What is this? I said, oh, it's a fractal. So I thought, what's that? And they said, well, it's a mathematical pattern. So I found this film narrated by Arthur C. Clarke, Colors of Infinity. And this film, it's a beautiful film. It's all over YouTube still in many languages. Demonstrates how the human body has fractal patterns, that we are fractal creatures in a fractal nature. I mean, the most recognizable fractals is the Fibonacci, which Leonardo was fascinated with. That the Fibonacci is self-similar no matter what the scale. And we have these spirals in our bodies, and the DNA double spiral is fractal. And the nervous system, and the film shows this beautifully, how the circulatory system, we have branches, and then it comes into the finer capillaries, and it looks just like the rivers that go into the deltas. And so when you're looking at the landscape from above, you see the same patterns that we have in our organs and circulatory system. And here's the key, the nervous system. The nervous system has dendrites, dendra, like from the Latin tree. So you have this dendrite, this tree branching nerve cell. And then you have the axons, and you have the space in between.
And also, if I recall, you were describing this hypnagogic state of the two beetles. The Mandelbrot fractal pattern kind of resembles a beetle.
They looked exactly like, and when I saw that film, they had the Mandelbrot, and I thought, those are the bugs that jumped into my head, that something was downloaded into my math-phobic nervous system, that this is the key, that we are fractal creatures in a fractal nature, in a fractal universe. And in the universe, if you're looking through a telescope or a microscope, you're going to see the same pattern, exactly the same pattern, and that we resonate with these patterns.
Now, you also had the opportunity to work with the victims or the therapists who were involved in working with the victims of the Columbine tragedy.
Yes, because then I realized that these dates are very important for social and collective trauma, not only in individual lives. I began to look, because I'm a historian, to look at dates in history and trauma. And during this time, the Columbine massacre happened. And at that time, the therapists in Littleton were not prepared for such a massive, overwhelming, unexpected, horrific event. And they needed supervision.
I mean, you are a traumatologist, but most psychotherapists are not trained in traumatology.
And they should be. And they should be, because they're working with trauma all the time. And they don't study history either, which they should. Because to really understand these replicating patterns in the collective, you need to know something about history. And in Littleton, I mean, there was absolutely no awareness that what happened in that high school had anything to do with anything that other than two bad kids and probably really horrible parents, which they weren't. They weren't. They were not horrible parents. These kids did not have a traumatic childhood at all.
Which deepens the mystery.
Yeah. So I began with a location, because I remembered that Rupert Sheldrake had said, places have fields of memory. And he figured this out where he lives in England, that he lives near a stretch of country road that has a traffic sign. In Britain, they have these traffic signs. It's simple. It's a black spot. And when you see the black spot, it says, be careful. Many accidents have happened on this place. But he said, this makes no sense, because this is not a congested area. This is not a complex. So he looked into the history of the place, and what he found is that this black spot place was the field where there was one of the bloodiest battles between the Protestants and the Catholics. So then I asked him, and I said, well, how do you settle down? He called it a field disturbance.
Back in the 16th century or so.
Yeah, how do you settle a field disturbance? He said, well, with this conflict, he said, you need representatives from both sides to come together with people from both communities, and you need to grieve together everyone that was killed, not only their own dead.
That's a big shift.
Huge.
Because lots of times I know when there are memorial ceremonies, they're for the victims, not the perpetrators. And if it's one country invaded another, they both have casualties, but they don't want the other side there.
And these war memorials heal nothing. They heal nothing. They stand as a monument to us and them. Winners and losers, perpetrators and victims. And he's saying, to settle a field, you need both. And all that were traumatized, killed, wounded, needed. So,
which is sort of, I gather, the pattern that began in South Africa when they after apartheid, when
Right.
they wanted to have this healing process.
It's coming around again in a difficult way, but that's
another story.
Yeah, but this field of place.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, okay, Littleton High School, let's see about Littleton. Let's find. And of course, during the Indian Wars, the Arapaho people were there. They were increasingly weak. And the army came, cavalry, and they had, quote, battles, which were not battles. They were massacres. So you had a military massacring old women and children and calling it something else. So there were lies, cover-ups, massacre right there in that region. So then I thought, okay, that's the place, because I was beginning to see an equation, algebra, beginning to see an equation evolving, place, date, okay. So the date was fascinating. The date originally in the boys' diaries was April 19th. And they chose that date for their, what they called, military mission. Okay, so again, we have the military. We have the military massacre. Okay. They chose the 19th because their hero was Timothy McVeigh, who had supposedly carried out the Oklahoma bombing on April 19th. Because there were two reasons. One was his outrage about the Gulf War, and he drove Bradley vehicle, which is like a bulldozer, where his job was to bury the half-dead people from the bombings. And he was outraged. He got home. This is the story. And he joined the militia. And he said, we have to bring this government down. He was furious about Waco and the massacre there, April 19th. And for the boys, he was their hero, so they chose his April 19th.
And a lot of terrorists do deliberately choose dates like that, anniversaries that they want to somehow call attention to when they commit an act of terrorism.
Yes, September 11th is another one. Definitely. It's a message with the date and the place. Timothy McVeigh joined the militia out of protest to the military. Mm-hmm. And in the militia, their heroes were the Revolutionary War militia. And the first shot of the Revolutionary War was April 19th, 1775. Mm. So there's the time fractal going through 1775 through all the way to Columbine. However, the boys were amateurs, and most of their plan was bombs. They were going to blow up the school, but their bombs fizzled, so they had to resort to shooting. But the plan was bombs. And because this is the connection to war. However, they couldn't get all their bombs into the high school in time so they said, okay, we'll do it on the 20th, which is Hitler's birthday.
Another anniversary.
Yeah, and they were neo-Nazis, and in the family system, I mean, there was no evidence of bad parents here anywhere. These were middle-class Republican parents in a suburb.
That may be a problem already.
But not the kind of trauma you would expect to produce two kids like this.
Yeah.
But on Dylan Klebold's side, there was a Holocaust history on his mother's side, and he was a neo-Nazi. And Eric Harris's family was military. His father was heavily involved in the Gulf War. And Michael Moore picked up on this because Littleton is the home of Boeing.
In his movie Bowling for Columbine.
Right. Mm-hmm. And these kids were on the bowling team. They went bowling that morning. Mm-hmm. And he picked up that the field of Littleton itself is military because Littleton's a military town. So that's more of the fields of this. And I followed this event over more than 10 years. And then I found out that the next generation, there was a young man who'd been a high school student there, went into the Navy, became a SEAL, and he was killed. And his parents commissioned a very large bronze statue of him in full military regalia. If you look at the pictures of Harris and Klebold as they were carrying out their massacre, they were in full military garb with grenades and all kinds of automatic weapons and so forth. So here's this Navy SEAL in full military regalia, crouched in a ready-to-respond position, and they placed the statue directly across from an elementary school. And I couldn't believe, I thought, my goodness, after what happened at Littleton High School, they put this kid with all of these weapons right across from an elementary school. And there was a huge thing in the town about it. And people were very upset that anybody saw a connection.
Yeah, because we tend to think of military as being a normal part of human existence. We regard soldiers as heroes, and we glorify the accomplishments of battle and warfare, and we think of that as normal without an appreciation of the potential reverberation of that militaristic mindset throughout the culture.
Which began when the cavalry massacred the Arapaho. And they called it a battle.
Yeah.
Which,
So one of your points is that these lies and cover-ups tend to perpetuate the very problem they're trying to conceal.
Because truth will out. Apparently.
Sooner or later.
Yeah. So I got deeper into fractal phenomena, looking at it in individual lives, looking at it in the culture. And then I had gotten as far as the nervous system is fractal with these dendrites, and there was a synapse event, I couldn't quite. And then I had found Sir Roger Penrose's Cycles of Time early on, around the time they were beginning to decipher the Mayan calendar, that it was not linear, it was fractal, and that they knew that time is fractal, and that's what he was saying. Heavy lifting for a history major, but I intuited from that book, Cycles of Time, that these cycles have intentionality somehow, that there's some dynamic underneath here that's potentially understandable somehow. So then, more recently, Sir Roger wrote a paper with Stuart Hameroff, and they said in the synapse there are these microtubules.
Well, throughout the whole neuron.
Yeah. And they called them like alpha and beta, but they're fractals.
Yeah.
And they're fractals. And they concluded that these microtubules were the seat, they call it the seat of quantum consciousness.
Yes. I would say it's not so much a conclusion as a hypothesis.
Yeah, I jumped to a conclusion for obvious reasons. But
the Ork-or theory of consciousness, about which I've done I think 8 interviews with Stuart Hameroff on this video channel. Our viewers can check our program listings to find them if they're interested. It's one of the most significant theories about how quantum interactions at the quantum level can interface with the human nervous system.
And the fractal universe.
Yeah.
Our fractal nervous system, the fractal universe, and
I might mention it's one of about 3 or 4 similar theories that move in that direction.
But you can see why I'm so fond of
Sure.
so fond of this one.
Yeah.
So that's as far as I've gotten with it. And clinically, I found it's very helpful for people to realize that what they thought was a one-off trauma, maybe, was actually connecting them to something greater. That it had to do with their belonging to a system, a culture, a race.
I guess it's fair to say that if you're a human being living on planet Earth, right now you are living within a matrix of trauma.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, we're living right now, right in the middle of one of the largest mass extinctions in the history of the planet, caused by humans. We don't think of it as trauma, but I'm sure it is.
It's trauma to the biosphere. Absolutely. And we're very disconnected from that reality, because otherwise people don't feel like they could get up and go through their day knowing that, good morning, it's the 6th extinction. I don't think I have to go to work. I mean, there's a compartmentalization that keeps us from getting overwhelmed with the reality of what we're actually experiencing.
Well, I'm under the impression, as a parapsychologist, I can tell you this, the one reason why people aren't more psychic, because I think of it as a natural gift available to everybody, is because we don't want to have to experience the pain of other people. We numb ourselves. We wall ourselves off to protect ourselves, really, from the trauma that is just there in the environment everywhere. People are sick and dying. Amongst other things. And so in order to really experience our full human potential, we need to be able to open ourselves up a little more to the pain in the world.
And many people feel that it's too overwhelming and they can't do it. I think,
it takes a special person to pursue your profession, to travel to war zones, to go into the most difficult environments and work with those people.
Yeah, but usually by the time I get there, the shooting is over. But I think in terms of the human nervous system and how we defend ourselves against overwhelming realities like the 6th extinction, is the way that the nervous system is constructed. We have a triune brain, and we have 2 hemispheres. And we have the ability to split thinking and feeling. And because of this, we can push a button and destroy a city and not feel anything. And healing, I think, for us individually and as a species, is to unite thinking and feeling. And that can be painful, challenging. And what I've found with people, that they don't feel they have enough resources to actually do that, to feel. That this splitting is a defense. And there's something about our species that it's a flaw, I think, in the design, that we can split, push a button, destroy a city, feel nothing.
I believe you cite in your book Stalin, who said the death of a single person is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic.
That's right. Yeah. Split. And I think this version of us, I think the split is the flaw in the design that may eventually destroy us. Because we can destroy ourselves without feeling it.
Well, you suggest that if we can begin to recognize these patterns,
Yes.
if we can appreciate the fact that we're all embedded in these fractals going backwards in time, maybe even forwards in time,
Could be.
as some parapsychologists would suggest, and out into space as well.
Yes.
Maybe as far back, for all I know, as the trauma that was the Big Bang.
Fragmentation.
Yeah, we might begin to heal the universe.
Well, that's a tall order. But, clinically, I find that helping the client or the patient to see their trauma as integral to the human condition, that this is not some personal feeling, this is it has to do with belonging, and it makes sense in belonging to something larger. Also, there's sometimes some very exciting detective work to do. How far back does this go? Where did it get started? And what's incomplete that keeps representing because it wants to reach resolution? And if we can find it, what is that and how to do it? And that's inviting the client to an adventure, which is different than giving them a diagnosis in the medical model. Well, you're damaged because you have these symptoms. But to invite them to the adventure of discovery is a whole different paradigm. And for me, more interesting as a clinician. And clients respond to the adventure in a very different way than a patient would to a doctor. Well,
Anngwyn St. Just, this has been an informative, even if a little bit painful, conversation. I mean, I'm probably no different than many other people who get a little nervous about facing the inner darkness, but it's good to do. So thank you so much for being with me. It's been ultimately a pleasure.
My pleasure as well.
And thank you for being with us.